All right. All right, everybody. It is 12 p.m. on the East Coast, so we are going to get started here. Thank you for taking some time out of your day. It's either 9 o'clock in the morning for you guys if you're out on the California coast, like Bob is out there in the West Coast, or it's noon here on the East Coast. I'm Alex Brashears. I'm the admin and moderator for Private Lending Lessons, which is hopefully how you found this particular event. If not, check out that group as well. Today, we have something that's really, really interesting, and I think it's talked about enough, is 1031 exchanges and something called Delaware Statutory Trusts. And I know when I talk to people, they don't generally know what that is, or they've maybe just heard the term. They don't know the kind of the inner workings of it. So I'm really excited that I found someone that's highly knowledgeable, been doing it for years. So I am going to go ahead and let him take the helm here. But go ahead and take it away, Bob. Let me know, if you want questions. I think we decided you're going to have questions throughout the
Sure.
presentation. So if anybody has questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. And then his
I'll be
associate,
back
Mr.
one
Doug.
second.
All right. His associate, Mr. Doug Zader, will kind of be monitoring the Q&A chat, or you feel free to kind of unmute yourself if you want to go ahead and just ask a question that way. And then his contact information is here on the front screen. So if you feel like reaching out, and since you're here, you registered for the event, we're also going to be recording this and emailing out the recording to everybody. So go ahead, take it away, Bob.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Bob Boggess, and I'm the CEO and Chief Strategic Officer for IREXA LLC. IREXA, originally Investment Real Estate Exchange Advisors, and we refer to it as IREXA. I've been in the real estate business since 1985. As a matter of fact, I did my first 1031 exchange in 1985. And I worked with some pretty heady people. If there are any exchange accommodators out there, I would say, think back to Jerry Long at Section 1031 Services. He was at the forefront of 1031 exchanges back in the 80s. Subsequent to that, I operated as a real estate agent, real estate professional, have a CCIM designation. And at the end of the century, I started doing exchanges there was a gap in the market about having to do with interest rates dropping. And I found a niche where I was working with owner users who were no longer users and their tenants who wanted to be buyers. And so I developed a little exchange business with that went on for a period of time. I kept looking for new avenues, and I found actually, I was contacted by Mark Quam, who had a company called Welton Street Investments, selling tenant in common investments, which are the predecessor to Delaware Statutory Trusts. And I joined his merry band of men, drank the Kool-Aid, and now I'm doing what I'm doing. And so IREXA was formed in 2009. 2009. We are a full service financial advisory company. We predominantly work in the arena of, let me just find the little, hold on one second. Let me go through the disclosures first. Always got to have these. So I developed a financial planning protocol I refer to as strategic tax mitigation. And strategic tax mitigation is it's an attitude, it's a concept. It's about paying only the taxes you're legally obligated to pay. So I've sought out investment types that will reduce taxes from ordinary passive portfolio income, the purchase and sale of assets, including real estate, and retirement and estate planning issues. So what we're going to talk about today is one aspect of that, and that's 1031 exchanges, which I think is just one of the latest and greatest tax plays in the U.S. at this point. As a matter of fact, it's so prevalent that President Biden has even taken when he was a candidate, has taken a view on it. So let's start with the 1031 exchange. So what is a 1031 exchange? So basically, the whole purpose of the 1031 exchange is to keep you from, it allows you to sell one or more properties, buy one or more properties in an integrated transaction. And in that integrated transaction, what happens is any gain that you have can be transferred into the transaction. And what you have to do to perfect that exchange is you have to use an accommodator or a third party that facilitates the transaction, specifically intended on keeping you from getting constructive receipt of the funds. So if you touch the funds, you have no exchange, you have a sale. And you have tax liability that's due. But if you do an exchange, you can potentially defer the entire gain from the sale of the property that you sold. We refer to it as the relinquished property. And 1031 exchanges are one of the great ways of building wealth, because if you think about it, ultimately what you're doing is when you complete that exchange, you've got a pile of money that really isn't yours. That's tax money, that's the government's. So now you're getting to play with the house's money. And people who are in the exchange business, they exchange, they exchange, they exchange. As a matter of fact, with the way present laws are pertaining to estate planning and that, one of the favorite terms is swap till you drop. You can exchange all the way to the point where you expire, your heirs get the asset, they get a step up in basis, and all the taxes go away. So that's the reason you want to look at completing exchanges or have that as part of what you do. Now, the downside of exchanges is, you can, if it doesn't make sense to do an exchange, you don't want to have the tail wag the dog. But in where all things are equal, an exchange is a very beneficial tool. So there's some rules. The first rule is property must be held in a trade or business or for investment. And investment is the operative word. You can be a developer, and if you're developing properties and you're buying and selling, that's not investment. And so that doesn't comply. As a matter of fact, there's some rules pertaining to the number of properties. For example, you can short plat a property and create 4 units, and you can sell those 4 units all in the same year. But if you and exchange each one of those. But if you create 5 units and you sell all 5 of those in the same year, you're deemed a trader, and you may not be able to exchange. So there's some subtle nuances in that. Both the properties, the relinquished and the replacement, must be similar enough to qualify for like kind. So what the heck does like kind mean? Well, an apartment for a piece of land, that's like kind. A farm for an office building, that's like kind. A lease in excess of 30 years for any of the above property types, it's also like kind. So it's pretty wide open, but it has to be in the US. So it could be in Guam, but not Puerto Rico, which I find interesting. And then to achieve full tax deferral, there are 2 rules. They're really simple, and it's amazing. People really get wound around their axle with this sometimes, because they'll come up with all sorts of schemes about what's necessary to defer gain in an exchange. It's real simple. Use all the money and acquire greater or equal debt. And when you do that, you have the ability to fully defer the exchange. If you don't use all the money, or you don't go equal or up in debt, you have excess. It's called boot. It's either mortgage boot or cash boot, and those are taxable events. And the way the government is, the tax hierarchy is this. They'll when you pay any tax, the first tax that you pay is depreciation recapture, because that's at a higher tax rate. When you've consumed all the depreciation recapture, then you pay at the long-term capital gains rate, which is a little bit lower. So there's some other rules, and those rules are timing and nomination type. So in an exchange, you are obligated to nominate properties within 45 calendar days from the sale, not extendable except by decree from the president. And that's generally in the case of a disaster or something like that. But it's 45 calendar days to nominate, and then you have 180 days from the sale of the relinquished property to complete your exchange, with the exception that in the event you your start date is less than 180 days from April 15th and you don't extend your taxes, then that 180th day becomes whatever day April 15th is. So when you're involved in an exchange, you may be extending your taxes as well. So the number of properties, and it's interesting, I've been doing this long enough to have kind of the history. So the number of properties that may be nominated, I think this was changed in the 90s, for example. And back prior to the number of properties being nominated, there were loose rules. It was a lot of gray area. And the common thing would be to just deliver the phone directory and say, here are my nominations. The IRS frowned on that, and so they established these rules. And the rules are, the first rule is the 3 property rule. So with the 3 property rule, you can nominate up to 3 properties of any value. And if you have, say you have $1 million to expend, you could nominate $3 million properties. You're probably only going to buy one. In the world I work in the fractional ownership property type of Delaware Statutory Trust, which we'll get into at the second part of this, you might nominate 3 properties at $1 million each and buy all 3 of them, but only buy 333,000 of each one. So you can do that. The second property rule is the 200% rule. So the 200% rule essentially says you can nominate as many properties as you want, as long as the fair market value of the replacement property is not greater than 200% of the fair market value of the relinquished property. So this is a very subtle nuance, but when I mentioned the 2 things that you have to do to defer the gain is go equal or up in debt and use all the money. There's nothing said about all of the closing costs and all of that sort of thing that's involved. That goes on top of it. When you use the 200% rule, you want to use the actual sales price on the purchase and sale agreement of the relinquished property for the 200% rule, rather than the net price of the to use on the 200% rule. It gives you more room on the back end of the deal and is permitted by code. With either of the first 2 rules, if you don't use all the money or don't go equal or up in debt, you create this boot situation, which is taxable. The 95% rule is a little bit hairy and more hairy, and you run into that primarily in the fractional ownership property type. And that rule says that you can nominate as many properties as you want, as long as you close on 95% of the fair market value of the properties being nominated. And this is a bit of a hairy rule, in that if you don't comply, you have the ability to blow up your entire exchange. So I'll give you an example. In the property type that we work in, DSTs, we run there are a lot of portfolios that are part of this. So a portfolio is generally more than one property. And oftentimes you'll find that you eliminate the 3 property rule if you nominate a portfolio. But if you're an all cash investor, if you have no debt on the property you sell, and you nominate a portfolio of however many properties plus one other property, and the loan to value of each of those is greater than 50%, you're automatically in the 95% rule. So it's the sort of thing that we're not afraid of it, but we want to be cognizant, because in our world, we like to close on the deals before the 45th day to ensure that we can get into everything and not to mitigate our clients' risk. Any questions on any of this stuff, or are we good to go? Or
Bob, a question that came up was, what's the likelihood of Biden getting rid of 1031 exchanges? What's your take on that?
well, yeah, that's interesting. So as a matter of fact, that's a slide that we're going to cover here shortly. So I'll address that a little more fully when we get there. So let's go on to as a matter of fact, here's the slide. So the history. Tax deferred exchanges have been around for 100 years. This is the 100-year anniversary. And it's gone through a lot of changes, mostly nuanced changes like the one I mentioned earlier about nominating the phone book to the 3 property rules, things like that. A lot of it was not black and white. It was just gray areas, and people would push the gray areas, and then there'd be lawsuits, and you'd find that, oh yeah, that rule really means this rather than that. So anyhow, everything is pretty well coded. There are not too many gray areas. Well, there are some, but I don't want to get out in the weeds. So current legislative activity. Candidate Biden in July 21st, in a Bloomberg article, made the statement that they were going to limit 1031 exchanges to people whose income was under 400,000. And that set everything on its ear. So, but there's not been anything said about it. Now I know that Biden, as of 3/15, there were a couple articles I read that they started talking about activity on this, and he's again mentioned the $400,000 number. So what happens is the problem with 1031 exchanges is the optics. So you look at it as though some fat cat is going to make a killing and not pay their due taxes. But the reality of the situation is, I'll give you an example. Reits, real estate investment trusts, they use 1031 exchanges all the time. Well, who owns the Reits? Investors. And the nature of the investors are, a lot of investors don't make 400,000. So the optics are really problematic for the exchange. But when you dig into it, the white papers put out by top accounting firms and economics firms and that indicate that by getting rid of the 1031 exchange, it will, in my terminology, it will reduce the flow of capital. Reducing the flow of capital will create a recession. And so there's a substantial GDP drop anticipated if they kill exchanges. And as a matter of fact, I can give you an example. So I was working on a case, couple owned 2 rental houses on a larger lot. The lot was zoned multifamily. So they probably were netting per year after all expenses about $25,000 on those 2 rental houses. The property was sold for $2 million. So using the example of a 5% return on the properties that we have, and you can achieve greater than that, but using that as an example, that sale of that property in exchange could take their income from $25,000 a year to $100,000 a year. So they're the fat cats in this example, making the big deal. But now think about what happens if the exchanges were outlawed. Those people's incentive to sell that property would decrease because the tax liability would be several $100,000, although they would come out ahead. No one wants to write a check of several $100,000 to the IRS. So what that would do is it would slow down the flow of money. And the money flow in this example is, who's the entity buying the property? What are they going to be doing? So it's probably an apartment or a condo developer. The apartment developer, if they're a merchant developer, they're going to sell that on the open market, pay ordinary income tax on that, not on 2 million, but on 20 or 40 million. You know, if it's and then think of the people who move into the apartment, new new tax revenue for the local and state and federal jurisdiction. And in the same case with condos, you've got that same tax multiplier. So why kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? So my position on all of this is we really need to increase the flow of capital rather than decrease the flow of capital. And I think that's the way everyone comes down on it that's knowledgeable about the situation. So I hope that answered your question. So under resources, and here's something you all can do. Write down these two URLs, 1031.org or 1031taxreform.com. Either one will get you to the other one. On the website, you have to look under resources. There are a couple of white papers that are really quite extensive. You might want to take a couple minutes of your time and print those out, put them in an envelope, put a stamp on the envelope with a nice little handwritten note and send it to your senator or representative, and let them know what your feelings are about it. And by the way, one of the things that we know is that a lot of Congress people use the 1031 exchange. So if you look at the situation, the current situation in the Senate, where it's 50-50, there are a number of Democrats who use 1031 exchanges. So I think it's a long and hard road for Joe, myself. But you know, the only way that we can be assured that it will not get wiped out is with help of people like you taking a few minutes to reach out to your Congress people and let them know what you think about this. So the forms of real estate ownership. So these are the basic forms of real estate ownership, and we use three of these in what we do. So there's sole ownership, direct ownership, direct investment, fee simple ownership. And that's the way that most of you buy properties unless you buy it in an entity. If you bought it in an entity like you and a friend or your LLC or something like that, it's still direct ownership. There are other rules that come to play relating to the entity, but you know, you can do 1031 exchange into it. It's not liquid. Real estate is not a liquid asset. You have control over it as the owner, and your price per unit is higher in the sole ownership. Tenant in common is was the first form of fractional ownership that became available, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So it allows for a common enterprise through the efforts of a third party with an expectation of a profit, which is why it's sold through the securities channel. That I just gave you the definition of a security. So tenant in common, it was the first foray into the fractional ownership world. It's not very common now. And we'll talk about that further in a second. The next form that came into play in 2004 is the Delaware Statutory Trust. And rather than holding title interest as you do in a tenant in common, you have a beneficial interest in a trust. And this has gotten rid of some of the problems with the TIC. You can 1031 exchange it. It's not liquid. It's a very passive investment where you cede control to the trustee and the asset management company, and the minimum investment is lower. The next one is the Real Estate Investment Trust, the REIT. The title is held by the corporation. You can't exchange directly into a REIT. And I'll further that in just a second. It's semi-liquid. There are abilities to redeem. There's no control. Average minimum investment is very low. So talking about exchanges into REITs. So we have companies that are sponsors, and one of their exit strategies is, as a matter of fact, we have one company that is a provider of net lease portfolios. And their exit strategy is every 5 years or so to sell the portfolios, and they sell it to a related third-party REIT. So they sell it to the REIT, and at that liquidation, you have the ability to take your money and pay your taxes. That gets no votes. Take your money and do a 1031 exchange. That gets a lot of votes. Or you can roll up into the REIT via 721 UPREIT exchange. And that UPREIT exchange will allow you to do a number of things. Like you don't have to do 1031s anymore, nor can you do a 1031. So that's a consideration. There's a redemption ability in a REIT. There is what we refer to as a death put in a REIT. So if you buy the property and pass away and your heirs get the property when it's in the REIT, after the step up in basis, your heirs can notify the REIT company and they will redeem the units at par immediately. So that's one way of getting ultimate liquidity for your heirs. So then this private REIT, what they're doing with that is they're building it up to, $1.5 billion assets under management, and then they'll take it public. So the great thing about that exit strategy is you start off with real estate and you end up with stock. It's just very terrific. The last is a real estate fund, LLCs, GP, LPs, that sort of thing. And generally the title is held by the partnership. You can't exchange as an individual partner in a partnership. You cannot complete a 1031 exchange. The partnership itself can complete an exchange, but you can't individually. So there are ways around that in most states, California not being one of them, and that is to drop out of the partnership, take title as tenants in common, which is item number 2, and then you can, assuming that the timing is correct and you've allowed it to mature long enough, then you'll be able to do an exchange with that. So history of the fractional ownership world, TICs and DSTs. So TIC equals a tenant in common, and TICs have been around since 1600s. You know, it's a very common way for people to take title. If one of you and I decided to buy a property together, we would often take title as a 50% undivided interest as a tenant in common. So that allows us to go our own way at the sale. But what happened here, Bill Paso, who's the founder of Pasco, was a syndicator, and in the 90s, he was doing syndications, and this situation came up where an associate of his or a client saw one of his syndications and asked if they could 1031 into it. So Bill took a look at that and said, you know, we can't do it as a partnership, but I wonder if we could do it as a tenant in common. So he wrote for a private letter ruling to the IRS and was the first person to do so. So he's really credited with starting this whole fractional ownership concept. The IRS said that the concept that's outlined by Bill would qualify for a 1031 exchange. And the way things happen in real estate, one person has a good idea, they mention it, everyone else grabs it, and all of a sudden the IRS is inundated with private letter ruling requests. So to deal with that, they put out a revenue procedure in 2022, or 2002, called 2002.22, which specified requirements for obtaining a private letter ruling. There were 15 items that you had to, 15 boxes you had to fit into. The interesting yet Machiavellian approach of the IRS was that you couldn't comply with all 50. The net effect of that was it caused people to move towards the center to try to comply, as opposed to forging new ground, trying to expand the box. And so you would get some when they were doing the private originally, you would have the acknowledgement that this may comply with 1031 exchange requirements by getting a legal opinion from an attorney who had experience in these matters. And the legal opinion was never, it will comply. The legal opinion we relied on was it should comply as opposed to not comply. And based on that, the TIC industry took off and was the predominant industry until about 2004. A little upstart showed up called the Delaware Statutory Trust, or DST. And that was outlined in a revenue ruling, 2004.86, and didn't gain traction as much. It started gaining traction, but TICs were pretty well in place and pretty well the form du jour until the crash of 2008. And during the crash of 2008, we found out that TICs had a fatal flaw in the structure. And one of the flaws was the fact that in order to do major things like sell the property or refinance the property, you had to have a unanimous decision by all of the TIC owners. So just imagine the situation where you have these TIC owners who are supposed to be real estate professionals, but they were professional in the fact that they were accredited investors, which a dubious distinction they got by just having enough money. Had nothing to do with their skill set or anything, which is a failure in the industry, but it's one we live with. So now you have all of these investors in a deal where, let me say a shopping center where the big box in the shopping center decided to go dark because they went bankrupt. Now you're sitting there, you don't have enough money to pay your mortgage. And so what the hell do you do? Well, let's go talk to the bank. Oh, wait a second, there's no bank. All of the financing for TICs were through a vehicle called a commercial mortgage-backed security. Similar to the mortgage-backed securities that fueled the subprime lending rage at about the same time. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the subprime debacle created the whole collapse, and TICs were painted with a broad brush of that mortgage-backed security, and the banking industry changed their rules, and we went through one heck of a mess. And the problem with commercial properties and that is that, you know, where a residential property might have a 30-year mortgage, commercial properties never did. You might have a 30-year AM schedule, but you might have a 10-year note. And if your note was coming due and you were levered up pretty well, you would find that you didn't have any financing available for you when your loan terminated. So you had to sell your property in a market where the sky was falling. And so more likely than not, you lost that property. It was a complete mess. So the DST really began to shine, and it shines because the owners really have no responsibility for making those decisions. The responsibility for making the decisions is through the owner, not the owner, but the sponsor, the signatory trustee, the asset management company. So they're in charge of making sure you don't lose the property and do whatever they can to make sure that that happens, including but not limited to refinancing the property, taking it out of the DST, doing whatever is necessary to preserve the asset. So the size of the market in 2020, the DST market was about 3.45 billion, and at the top in 2007, the TIC market size was about 2.65, and that's what this looks like. This is from a company called Mountain Dell Consulting. They're a research company in the DST market, and you can see what's happened since 2002. So 2002 was the start of the TIC market. It went up like crazy to 2006, 2007 tailed off. It was virtually gone. 2009, 2010. My business was such in 2008. I was picking up this telephone in August of 2008 just to see if I had a dial tone, because no one was ringing my phone. And eventually things came back, liquidity came back in 2012, started coming back in, and now the market is moving along at a pretty good clip. 2020, it says 3.2 billion, but actually the fourth quarter in 2020 was absolutely crazy. So 2020 and 2019 were essentially the same level. But we've run into a fundamental problem in the industry, and that fundamental problem is we have high demand and low inventory. So the difference between a TIC and a DST at a high level, in a TIC, the investor holds title to the asset. In a DST, investors have a beneficial interest in the trust. TICs are limited to 35 investors maximum, and DSTs have just under 500 investors. So you can see that with a TIC, you're limited to much smaller properties or higher minimum investment. With a DST, even the largest properties, you can get in for 100,000. With a TIC, all decisions require investor agreement, and with a DST, all decisions reside with the sponsor, that is the trustee and the asset manager. The TIC has a more flexible ownership structure. You can refinance, you can do construction. The DST is completely inflexible. The TIC has some investor control because the investors make the decision, and the DST has no investor control. So this gives you an example of the investor control that you have in a DST. This is called the 7 deadly sins. So item 1, once the offering is closed, no more equity contributions, no cash calls. 2, you can't change the loans, nor can you refinance. You can't get money from anyone else. 3, the trust can't reinvest the funds of the sale. It goes to the individual investors. 4, the trust is limited to making capital expenditures for normal repair. So you can't do construction. The most that you can do in a DST is do a unit refurb, like paint carpets, appliances, countertops, and light fixtures, and that's it. 5, any liquid cash has to be in short-term instruments or distributed. All cash must be distributed, so the trust can't hold on to money. And the trust cannot enter into leases. So imagine a multifamily property. How do you do that? Well, you have a master tenant. So it's another layer. The master tenant handles the negotiations with the tenants, and the master tenant has a fixed relationship with the sponsor. So this is what we do. IREXA LLC is, as I mentioned, is a full-service financial advisory service. We primarily provide 1031 replacement property solutions to accredited investors, qualified purchasers, real estate investment entities using all forms of 1031 compliant real property ownership, such as sole ownership, TICs, and DSTs. We work with syndicators and real estate operators to provide access to and facilitate their raising capital through the BD channel. And we provide capital to syndicators via 1031 investors for those syndicators that can handle TIC investments. And so if any of you are syndicators, please reach out. We'd like to talk to you about what you do and how we can work together. And then we also facilitate access to capital of mezz and senior debt from our financial partners to people who, and real estate operators that need capital. And that's
a question
that's
that
where we
came up
are.
asked if we are broker dealers.
Pardon? Say that, Doug?
Question came up. Are you guys broker dealers?
We work for a broker dealer. We work for, actually, I'm located in Seattle. My partner, Doug Zader, formerly with Cantor Fitzgerald, is located in California. Our broker dealer is located in Chicago. We have clients from the Virgin Islands to Hawaii and all spots in between. So we're a nationwide service. And the way I like to look at it is we like doing business with people that are open for business. So I'll take any questions if you have any.
Hey, Robert, my name is Jonathan New. I've got a quick question. It's more of a philosophy question for you.
Sure.
It was a great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm curious, do you think that 1031s are part of the crazy market that we're in? Like all these prices are insanely high. And my thought is that a lot of it has to do with, I got to place this money right now. I don't care where it goes. I'll pay way over asking just to put my money to work.
Yeah, there is some of that, but I think I'll give you what I think it may be even a better example. So we have, this market has had a long run. So the top of the last market was 2007. We went down to 2009, 10. So we've had a 10-year run up. And now people are trying to monetize their gains. And then you have somebody like one of our sponsors, Exchange Right, who provides net lease portfolios. Exchange Right did probably $1 billion worth of business last year. And their acquisition and creation of portfolios and all of that accelerated to the point that we think that they pretty well sucked the net lease capital pool dry. And so now they've taken the cream of the crop. The properties that they haven't taken are not, they're not the best properties, and yet there's people are trying to place capital, and the whole thing builds on itself. It accelerates. It is. It's like a fire that gets flame. I don't know that 1031s are the lead. The unfortunate thing with 1031s is that people allow the wart on the hair on the wart on the tail of the dog to wag the dog. And so with 1031s, buying anything is an unfortunate circumstance because people make bad decisions, and real estate decisions are with you for a long time. Fortunately, we have a number of other, and I'm just going to launch off in a slightly different direction. We have other ways of dealing with 1031s. We have a product called a qualified opportunity zone that became available in 2017, which is another way of monetizing your gain and deferring the taxes and actually ultimately ending up with a tax-free solution if held long enough. So there are some other solutions we were working with that are non-1031, but some accountants are saying, taxes are as low as they're going to be. So if you're going to bite the bullet, bite it now. I'm not very comfortable with that. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, tax deferral guy, so that doesn't suit me. But I think it's really incumbent on people who are caught up in that 1031 mania to really look around and see what's available. We have excellent products that I'm working with a lot of off-market deals where we can get double-digit returns and that sort of thing, but it requires a little bit greater capital. So does that answer your question, Jonathan?
Yes, sir. Thank you very, very much.
You betcha. Any other questions? Well, Alex, do you have any questions?
I think you're on mute still, Alex.
This is
There we go.
This is who?
Sorry, this is Mike Torphy. I have a question regarding
Sure.
exchanges of raw land, specifically farmland.
Okay.
And in the area that I work, that's a common issue associated. Now, obviously, we've got an inheritance tax that's now hit a threshold that's high enough that that's going to avoid most family farm type stuff, but that may not remain that way.
Right.
And one of the things that I had posited to a couple of guys was maybe we could work with neighboring farmers and develop an exchange that would allow them to effectively remain on their farm and farm other people's land because they've exchanged.
Oh, that's interesting. I see. I don't see why not.
So
the problem is the person that's moving out of the property. How do they get compensated in that deal?
So when you say moving in and out of the property, how do you?
Well, the person, say the person who's selling the property or the estate that's liquidating and providing capital to the heirs. I mean, because normally you have that situation. If you don't have that situation, you can do whatever you want, but it's requiring the funding to liquidate the estate.
So one of the pieces that I at least in my review of all this stuff, was that you had to segregate off an appropriate amount of acreage upon which the owner occupied house was, because
Yes,
otherwise the entire area would be a homestead. So that would not qualify as an investment property. But if you did that, and you did that, enough in advance, then you were okay.
Right. And what you've got is you've got your house with the land that's appropriate for the house as a personal residence, and that has its own tax exclusion. So for a single person, it's $250 tax-free. First $250 of profit is tax-free, and for a married couple, the first $500 is tax-free. Oftentimes, that's the determiner for the size of the piece of land that sits around the house, so that piece becomes a tax-free event. And then the balance of the land can be 1031 to exchange, but it's generally sold to a third party. And the aggregation into a larger land situation where people can, farm and all of that, that's controlled by the marketplace. And so I think what you'll find is I've worked with a number of farmers, and they prefer dealing just in land, because for them, the rent is commensurate with the value that they're actually paying for the property. So I can see that it can work, but somehow someone has to bring liquidity into the situation to make that second part of what you're talking about work. But the exchange itself, breaking the house and the acreage off at about a value of $500K, and then 1031ing the balance, you can do that all day long.
Well, I guess where I was going was, and maybe I probably wasn't getting there quick enough, and I apologize, was
no problem.
How would I utilize, if I wanted to use a Delaware Statutory Trust to effectuate a situation where people could effectively trade in, assuming that we could get this trust to be capitalized, trade in with their land, and now they're members of the Delaware Statutory Trust as a result of their land trade in.
Wow, trading land into the trust. You need a securities attorney.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Thank you.
All right. You bet. Take care.
Question that came in, what about reverse 1031 exchanges? What are the timelines?
Yes. Okay. So reverse 1031 exchanges, that's a subset, and we rarely run into it, but you can. And so the idea is you have, the only rule that applies there is you have 180 days. You buy the replacement property first with funds that you loan to the accommodator. And then you have 180 days to close on the sale of your relinquished property. That money goes to the accommodator, and then they give it back to you. And it's a little more complicated. The fees are a bit higher, but it can be done. Any more questions?
It looked like we just had one other that I think you probably answered, but do you work with investors all over the US?
Yes, we're licensed in every state that we need to be. And if we're not licensed there, it's a 24-hour turnaround. But yeah, we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have clients from the Virgin Islands to Hawaii and all points in between.
Robin Ann has a question, it looks like. Robin, you can, yep.
Hi, guys. My name's Robin. And
Robin.
hi. So do you work with syndicators and sponsors that do blind pools?
Blind pools. We can, I mean, ultimately, what we're trying to do is find homes for our 1031 exchange investors. So we would establish a relationship with a blind pool, and then as properties are identified, we would want to
acquire tenant in common slices of those properties.
Okay, and all right, I will reach out to you guys later on. We can talk about specifics.
Okay, that's perfect. Look forward to it.
Thank you.
And I don't see anything else coming up in the chat. Do you have anything else, Doug?
No, that's it. I'm not seeing any other ones as well.
All right, perfect. So if anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. Otherwise, this is going to be the best contact information for Bob is going to be here on the screen that you can see. You can reach out to him, and obviously this will be recorded, so it's going to be sent out as a recording. So if you didn't catch everything or you want another pass through for all this fantastic information he provided, you'll be getting a link to that as well in the future. So otherwise, thank you.
Yeah, if you want to reach out at rboggess@irexa.net, I'm happy to send the deck over to you. We do consulting, you know, so if you're involved in real estate and you want to toss ideas around, we're happy to do that. We're collaborators. We're open for business. We like doing this stuff.
Fantastic, thank you. And I can go ahead and attach those in the group as well for as a resource for people to reach out to that way as well.
All right. Perfect.
Fantastic. Well, thank you everybody
spring
for
is
coming.
almost here, so enjoy yourself, and it's actually sunny in Seattle.
Oh, well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I know I learned something new every time. You know, I was talking with Doug before. I learned something new every time I talked to one of the two of you. So thank you for spending some time with us, and thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for
Thank
hosting,
you for
Alex.
having us.
Thank you.